It was just after 8:30 a.m. on December 6, 1917, when the people of Halifax, Nova Scotia first heard the warning blasts from out on the harbour. Gathering on the decks, they would have seen the whole thing unfold in slow motion. The Norwegian steamer Emo and the French ship Mont Blanc on a collision course. It would have been a chilling sight, but most had no idea what was coming. Even when the boats collided, even when tongues of flame began to envelop the Mont Blanc, even when they saw the frantic gestures of the men aboard the vessels, those on the docks would have thought they were safe. They would have thought their town was safe. Until at 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. The blast was like nothing the world had ever seen before. The largest man-made explosion of the pre-nuclear age had been unleashed on this unsuspecting Canadian harbour, releasing devastating amounts of energy into the chilly December air. What began as a slow coming together of two crafts out on the harbour had become a disaster that obliterated the Richmond area of Halifax and sowed death and destruction over a 16-mile radius. The explosion created a shockwave that was felt 100 miles away in New Brunswick. It shattered windows, twisted telegraph poles, and uprooted trees over a massive area. Shortly after, a huge wave smashed into the harbour, washing far inland. Many who survived the blast were drowned as the sea rolled in. At least 1,782 people died. Thousands more were badly hurt, many with life-changing injuries. While Canadian soldiers were fighting the First World War in Europe, the explosion brought devastation to the Dominion's own shores. Such was Nova Scotia's suffering that the disaster became part of Canada's collective World War I experience and may even have contributed to her eventual independence. And in fact, this tragedy and suffering could have been even greater. From the carnage came stories of heroism and self-sacrifice, one in particular that may have saved hundreds of lives. In the aftermath, as the people of Halifax tried to rebuild, they found the disaster had left hundreds of children orphans, thousands of people homeless, and had obliterated communities on both sides of the harbour. They were also forced to confront the divisions that fractured Canadian society, divisions that would remain for decades after the event. I'm Andy Roberts, and this is the story of the Halifax Harbour Explosion, a disaster that World War I veteran Duncan Gray described as the worst that I ever hoped to see in the world, 1,000 times worse and more pathetic than anything I saw in the war. In a physical sense, World War I would have felt somewhat distant to Canadians in December 1917. Around 3,500 miles separated eastern Canada from the muddy hellscapes in France and Belgium. The struggle and the bloodshed was taking place on a completely different continent. But in an emotional, psychological sense, it would have felt frighteningly near. Canadian troops had been fighting and dying in their thousands on European battlefields since 1915. At Vimy Ridge in April of 1917, 3,598 Canadians had lost their lives. At Passchendaele that autumn, Canadian casualties exceeded 15,600 dead and wounded. With a population of less than 80 million, many Canadians back home would have lost a loved one to the fighting, or would be anxiously awaiting news of a family member deployed overseas. But it wasn't just fighting men that Canada contributed to the war effort. This dominion of the British Empire also provided military and medical supplies in vast quantities, as well as food and other goods that were in short supply in Europe. As the closest Canadian port to the fighting, Halifax became key to the wartime supply chain. This was how, at the beginning of December 1917, the Emo and the Mont Blanc found themselves on a disastrous collision course in Halifax Harbour. The evening of December 5th would have been a nervous one for the crew of the Mont Blanc. The vessel had arrived at Halifax Harbour at 4 p.m, packed with munitions, ready to be sorted and sent out to the fields of France. But the harbour authorities had already deployed the submarine nets. She would not be entering the harbour that night. The German U-boats were a real concern for Atlantic shipping. In May 1915, a U-boat had torpedoed the liner Lusitania, sending 1,200 people to their deaths. By 1917, subcrews had a target to sink 600,000 tons of shipping a month. This would have been on the crew's mind as they sat like sitting ducks beyond the mouth of the harbour. But early the following morning, their fears would have eased. The nets were lifted and the Mont Blanc was cleared to enter. This meant steaming into the Narrows, a tight bottleneck between Halifax on the southwest side of the harbour and the city of Dartmouth on the northeastern side. Around the same time, the Norwegian ship Emo was getting underway. She was sailing from the Bedford Basin northwest of Halifax and was bound for New York, ready to collect supplies bound for occupied Belgium. By 8:15, both ships were steaming towards one another in the Narrows. While the Narrows were certainly constricted, Halifax Harbour was well managed. There was a designated lane for inbound vessels and one for outbound vessels. With tons of munition, fuel, and other hazardous materials entering and exiting the harbour each day, this strict organisation was critical. But when a tugboat blocked the Emo's way, she found herself veering dangerously into the opposite lane on the north side of the channel. Francis Mackay, the pilot aboard the Mont Blanc, was horrified to see the Emo looming ahead of him. As the Emo passed the site of the Micmac village at Tufts Cove, Mackay gave a sharp warning blast, alerting the Emo's crew to the impending danger. The Emo responded, but both vessels remained on a collision course. Now dangerously close, both the Mont Blanc and the Emo attempted evasive action. The Emo pulled to starboard, back towards the channel she was supposed to be in. But Mackay's hand was already forced. With such a dangerous cargo, he should not risk veering towards the shore and running aground. And so, disastrously, the Mont Blanc pulled away from the shore to port. This meant both vessels were drifting in the same direction, and a collision was imminent. As both ships cut their engines, the only sound would have been the frantic shouts of the sailors carrying across the water. At the last moment, this quiet was pierced by 3 blasts from the Emo's horn, and by the sound of her engines roaring into reverse. This was what sealed the catastrophe. The sudden thrust from the Emo's engines sent the craft into a yawing motion, and the nose of the ship swung to port. Both crews could now only watch as the Emo's nose swung sideways and struck the Mont Blanc. With a screaming and screeching of metal, the nose embedded itself in the other ship's hull. These were big vessels. The Emo was 131 meters long, while the Mont Blanc was a little shorter, at only 98 meters. But despite the vast forces at play, damage was slight. They collided at such a low speed that neither ship was in danger of sinking. But the Mont Blanc was fully laden with munitions, with crates and barrels stacked upon one another. The impact had sent some of that cargo toppling onto the deck, breaking open. This flooded the ship with highly flammable, highly volatile benzol. Meanwhile, the Emo was still reversing her engines, hoping to pull herself out of the entanglement. Now there was more grinding of metal as the two hulls chafed against one another. As the metal sparked and crackled with the friction, the crew of the Mont Blanc yelled to the Emo to stop. It was too late. Sparks from the grinding metal poured onto the Mont Blanc's deck. The benzol ignited, and the Mont Blanc was suddenly awash with flame. A fire aboard any ship is certainly a disaster, but at this point those nearby were likely unaware of just how serious this was going to be. The tugboat Stella Maris was close by when the ships collided. Her captain, Horatio Brannan, pulled alongside the Mont Blanc, and the crew began spraying the stricken vessel with a hose. Other vessels came to the rescue too. HMCS Niobe sent 6 volunteers aboard a small pinnace to the Mont Blanc, while Commander Tom Triggs of the HMS Highflyer took a small whaling vessel to the scene. After discussing the situation with Brannan, Triggs changed course and headed over to the Emo, keen to offer his assistance. The time was now almost 9 a.m. The Mont Blanc had been burning for close to 15 minutes, and her explosive cargo was now in a dangerous condition. On board the French ship, the crew had given up hope of fighting the fire. Captain Le Medec and his men understood that the Mont Blanc was now a death trap. They abandoned ship, rowing desperately for shore while yelling out to the nearby craft to clear the area. Unable to understand the crew's shouts in French, the other craft simply stayed where they were. The Medec and his crew did reach the shore, But they didn't stop here. They began scrambling up the thickly wooded hill to higher ground, knowing just what was coming when their ship finally blew. Over on the docks, sailors began to stream ashore. Many were by now fully aware of what was happening aboard the Mont Blanc. They knew it was only a matter of time before the Mont Blanc blew. Some also understood that the ship had been abandoned. There was no one aboard to stop her drifting ever closer to the harbor. The countdown to disaster at this point was well and truly ticking. As the sailors raised the alarm, chaos reigned on the harbor. But from this chaos comes a story of astonishing heroism that undoubtedly saved hundreds of lives. On December 6, 1917, Vincent Coleman was a railway dispatcher in Halifax. Seeing people streaming from the docks, desperately trying to escape what was surely coming, Coleman did what most of us would do. He left his post and joined them. Known as Vince to his friends, Coleman was 45 years old and had a wife and 4 young children at home. He would save his own skin. He would make it home to his family. But something stopped him. As he left his office, his mind returned to the manifest of trains running that day and to the overnight express coming in from St. John, New Brunswick. With 300 passengers on board, the train would be right in the blast radius when the Mont Blanc went up. So Coleman did something incredible. He stopped running, he turned, and he went back to his post. For 100 kilometers north of Halifax, as far as Truro, the Morse code receivers of dispatch offices began bursting into life. It was Coleman, tapping out desperate messages. "Hold up the train," Coleman signaled to his colleagues. "Ammunition ship fire in harbor, making for Pier 6, and will explode." We can't know quite what was going through Coleman's mind in those moments. It's possible he looked out from the telegraph room, across the harbor, to the ship belching black smoke into the sky from the Narrows. What seems certain is that he understood the full gravity of the situation. He understood that he was living through his final minutes on Earth. With a heavy heart, Coleman returned his attention to his machine and tapped out one final communication for his colleagues. "Guess this will be my final message. Goodbye, boys." At 9:04, the largest man-made explosion in history up to that point ripped across Halifax Harbor. The blast was truly enormous, probably more so even than the most pessimistic of onlookers had realized. The pinnace from the Niobe was destroyed, its crew wiped out. 11 people aboard the Niobe itself were killed. The High Flyer was similarly shattered. From the High Flyer's whaler, only one man, William Becker, survived. Captain Brannan and 18 members of his 23-man crew aboard the Stella Maris were killed. Most of the crew of the Emo perished in the blast. Watching from the hillside on the Dartmouth side of the harbor, Lemedec and his men survived, but their ship was completely torn apart by the explosion. Pieces of the Mont Blanc were launched 1,000 feet into the air, soaring up to 3 miles from the wreck before they fell to earth. The ship's anchor shank, which weighed 1,000 pounds, literally half a ton, was found 4 miles away from the blast site. A deck gun was eventually located 3 miles away. The cloud of smoke and debris reached 20,000 feet into the atmosphere, while 12,000 buildings over a radius of 16 miles suffered damage. The Richmond district of Halifax, closest to the harbor, was completely wiped out. While many had attempted to flee the harbor, the danger was not obvious to everyone. As is so often the case with an unfolding disaster, some came in the opposite direction, eager to get a look at the great ship burning in the Narrows. Large numbers of people crowded onto a bridge that had recently been constructed across the city's rail yards. This had given them front row seats as the ship poured its black smoke into the air, and impressed whoops went up whenever an exploding barrel or shell case sent a tongue of flame erupting from the hull. But now it put them directly in harm's way. The collection of schoolchildren, housewives, workmen, and other citizens were swept away as the shockwave tore across the harbor. Many of the bodies simply vaporized. Anyone within range was pummeled by the percussive power of the blast. Billy Wells had been driving a motorized fire engine known as Patricia when the blast knocked him out of his machine. "The first thing I remember after the explosion was standing quite a distance from the fire engine," he said, recounting his miraculous survival 50 years later. "The force of the explosion had blown off all my clothes, as well as the muscles from my right arm." Barbara Orr was 14 at the time of the explosion and had been making her way to school when she spotted the burning ship. The blast launched the child into the air. She landed more than 500 meters away on a slope in what is now Fort Needham Memorial Park. She remembered regaining consciousness, covered in a thick layer of dark black soot that clung to her skin and clothes. She suffered serious injuries to her feet and ankles, but she would survive. Her entire family, including her 5 siblings, would be killed in the disaster. Many of those who survived the initial blast were drowned by the surge of water that followed it. The massive explosion had displaced an enormous amount of water, which was now rolling across the harbor in all directions. When this smashed into Halifax, it was 18 meters or 60 feet above the high water mark. It rolled 3 blocks inland, destroying vehicles and drowning people in their hundreds. Billy Wells remembered the devastation that this caused. "After the wave had receded, I didn't see anything of the other firemen, so I made my way to the old magazine on Campbell Road," Billy remembered. The sight was awful, with people hanging out of windows, dead, some with their heads off, some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires. The wave devastated communities right across the harbor, as well as the Richmond district of Halifax. The city of Dartmouth was hit hard by the wave. Many victims were drowned, while others were swept out to sea, never to be seen again. As the water receded, the rescue effort began immediately. The city that had helped recover the bodies of the Titanic victims only 5 years earlier was now the scene of its own maritime disaster, and with an even greater death toll. It was clear from the outset that Halifax resources were dangerously overstretched. Fire engine driver Billy Well needed serious medical attention. He described his own experience. "I was taken to Camp Hill Hospital and lay on the floor for 2 days waiting for a bed," Billy said. "The doctors and nurses certainly gave me great service." Aware that Halifax was in desperate need, local cities lent a hand. As military personnel joined the rescue and relief effort, cities like Truro and Eton opened homeless shelters to support the thousands who had lost their homes. A relief train arrived from Boston in the United States, bringing much-needed medical supplies and personnel into the area. A dozen other relief trains arrived in Halifax that same day as communities across Nova Scotia reached out to those in need. But Halifax's trauma was far from over. A blizzard on December 7th covered the city with deep snow, over a foot deep in many places. This stalled rescue efforts and contributed to the death toll as those made weak by injury were subjected to extreme cold. As the storm abated, volunteers worked day and night to treat the wounded and offer support to survivors. And slowly, the city began to heal. The war in Europe would rage for 11 more months after the Halifax explosion. When it came to the end in November 1918, thoughts began to turn towards a new world, and what that would look like. Canada was granted its own seat at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and 1920. The pressure exerted by the Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden paved the way for many other imperial dominions to be granted the same status, including Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and South Africa. Canada was still a long way from total independence, but the efforts of Canadian soldiers during World War I and the supplies she provided across the Atlantic significantly accelerated these moves. The immense trauma of the Halifax explosion was part of this. The explosion had occurred because of munitions entering and exiting the harbor. The massive devastation and civilian death toll meant that Canada had experienced the horrors of war on her own soil, sharing the experience of war-torn nations across the world. But while the Halifax explosion became symbolic of Canadian resilience and helped form a shared national identity, it also exposed the bitter divisions at the heart of Canadian society. At Tufts Cove, on the Dartmouth side of the harbour, was Micmac community known as Turtle Grove. Only 500 meters from the point where the ships collided, Turtle Grove bore the full brunt of the explosion. 10-year-old Rachel Cope was one of the Micmac at Turtle Grove. She remembered her own experience of the horror. For an instant, the town of Richmond seemed to shimmer like a reflection in a still pond, Rachel remembered. And then, everything went black. Rachel's brother, Henry, aged 12, and her 14-year-old cousin were both alongside her, and sadly, both died. Rachel's sister, Sarah, and Sarah's baby daughter, Annie, also lost their lives. Rachel herself was expected to die, but pulled through. At the time of the explosion, it's believed there were around 17 Micmac families living in Turtle Grove. Many of these families lived in traditional structures, which would have stood almost no chance when the shockwave hit. When this was followed by the tsunami, the destruction would have been enormous. And yet no one seemed quite sure how badly Turtle Grove had been hit. While record-keeping was meticulous in Canadian cities in the early 20th century, such care was often not afforded to First Nation communities. Similarly, little care was taken to understanding the suffering of the Micmac following the disaster. Initial records said only 9 Micmac had lost their lives. It's now believed to be more than 3 times this number and possibly far higher. In fact, the total number of dead has increased several times over the years as city officials and then city historians sought to gain a fuller picture of exactly what happened. Immediate reports suggested at least 1,535 people had lost their lives, with 9,000 injuries. But the Nova Scotia Archive is working on a more comprehensive list in memory of all of those who died. As of 2025, the number of names has risen to 1,782. It may still rise further. While Halifax grew and flourished following Reconstruction, Turtle Grove was never rebuilt. The Micmac survivors were simply moved on and relocated somewhere else, far from the lands that had been at the core of their culture for centuries. And Turtle Grove wasn't the only place that was ignored during the region's reconstruction. The town of Africville, for example, was a mainly black community in Bedford Basin. While Africville was spared the mass loss of life suffered by Richmond, it was still seriously damaged. And yet this damage was never surveyed, and none of the relief money ever reached Africville. While Halifax rose from the ashes, Africville remained without running water or paved roads for decades, until it was demolished in the late 1960s. The 1917 explosion was a truly enormous blast, as Halifax historian Jay White said in 1994, "Halifax Harbour remains unchallenged in overall magnitude as long as 5 criteria are considered together. Number of casualties, force of blast, radius of devastation, quantity of explosive material, and total value of property destroyed." But from great tragedy come stories of great heroism and selflessness. From Vincent Coleman in his dispatching office to Horatio Brannan on board the Stella Maris, and to the nurses and rescue workers who worked tirelessly to save lives. These stories show us the very best of humanity in times of crisis. But the treatment of the communities at Turtle Grove and Africville shows us something else. They show us how social division and prejudice can leave entire communities behind, even when everyone is supposed to be pulling together. Halifax has been rebuilt and continues to look to the future without forgetting its shared past. In recent years, local authorities have worked with the Micmac to repatriate their sacred artifacts and these ancestral lands, and to honor their community. Similarly, the cultural contribution of Africville has been recognized. The government has even offered a public apology and compensation to those who lost their homes when the neighborhood was bulldozed in the 1960s. All of this comes too late for the people whose lives were turned upside down by the tragedy of December 6, 1917, and who were left waiting for help that never came. But it is at least a suggestion that perhaps lessons are being learned from the past. Each year, Rachel Cope's great-niece, Kathy Martin, visits the spot where her family once lived. From Tufts Cove, she looks out across the harbour, and she honours the names of those who lost their lives. "Their spirits are here," Kathy says. "The more we say their names, the better they can rest and know that we haven't forgotten them." Now, more than a century on, that's all we can do. Remember and honour those who lost their lives and the survivors for whom life would never be the same again.